Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's episode, we're focusing on immigration in the workforce, specifically the role that legal immigration reform can play in reshaping our nation's workforce in the short and long term. Theresa Cardinal Brown, BPC's Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, will be joined by Ben Gitis, Associate Director of the Economic Policy Project at BPC, and Douglas Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum. Ben was Director of Labor Market Policy at the American Action Forum before joining BPC. Doug has held a variety of influential policy positions throughout his career, including a stint as the Director of the Congressional Budget Office from 2003 to 2005.
Welcome back. This is Theresa Cardinal Brown from the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm going to apologize early. I am recovering from COVID, so my voice is a little hoarse, but I am really happy to be hosting this podcast today to dive into labor market data, demographics, and immigration with two economic experts, BPC's own Ben Gitis and Doug Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum. You can find them on Twitter at Ben Gitis and at DJH Eakin. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Doug, we're going to start with you as the senior economist here. Can you just start by laying out how we can measure the economic impact of U.S. immigration policy? It seems like a question that gets asked all the time, but how do we do it? Like when you were at the CBO, at the Congressional Budget Office, how does the government measure this, and do you think there are other ways to measure it?
Well, you can start at the very, very macro level and look at the total production in the United States. And total production, as it turns out, is number of workers times output per worker, and that's productivity. And so it's pretty easy to count people, and we know how many of them are immigrants and how many are descendants of immigrants, and thus the contribution to the quantity of labor in the economy, pretty straightforward. Productivity, tougher to measure, but we have indicators of productivity that we have a lot of faith in, such as over long periods of time, real wages. People who are more skilled and productive get paid better. So we can look at how many immigrants we have. We can see where they are in the economy. We can look at the real wages in the economy where immigrants are located. And if they're higher than in other parts, we know they're generating some productivity. And now you've got basically a lot of the key inputs for how big has been their contribution in turning us from the 13 colonies to the largest, most powerful economic force the globe has ever seen. And then you just go on from there to do things you care a lot about. How many startup companies are there? Well, it turns out immigrants disproportionately start up companies. And so we get some information from that. They disproportionately hire people and create jobs. And that's a little information that we like to get. And so we can really go through the different aspects of economic life and find where first, second, third generation immigrants are making a difference.
Based on the studies that you've seen, how big an economic impact have immigrants made?
For the U.S., it's all about immigration. Literally, we are a country of immigrants, and if you go back far enough, it's all due to immigration that in the U.S. At any point in time, it's really important to remember that the native-born population has had sub-replacement fertility, not enough kids to even keep the population constant. So at some level, for a while now, it's all about immigration. The growth of the population, the growth of the labor force is all due to immigration decisions, and the contribution of immigration to our future is literally 100%. In the absence of immigration, we would shrink in size, in economic importance, and in our ability to control events around the globe. So I can't overestimate the importance of immigration as an economic policy.
So, Ben, you've done a lot of work looking at the U.S. labor force and our labor market in general. Can you talk a little bit about what our current labor force looks like and how much immigrants are part of that labor force?
Sure. So our labor market today is what many economists like to refer to as a tight labor market. We have low unemployment, a lot of job openings, but that's also created issues for our broader economy because what's behind all that is a labor supply problem. Our labor force participation rate declined sharply following COVID and has only partially rebounded. We're still about 1.3 percentage points away from where we were before COVID started. And that may not sound big, but that translates to roughly 3.5 million workers. So we still have a ways to go back to where we were before COVID. And the question of, how does immigrants fit into this picture of our broader labor force? Immigrants are a big chunk of our labor force. Typically, they're about 18% of our labor force, and foreign-born workers work at a higher rate than native-born workers. And the only thing that the issue that the United States has been running into with our immigration levels, however, in the workforce is that it's declined in COVID, and I'm not sure if it's quite rebounded yet. We went from about that 18% level to about 14% of workers being immigrants. A lot of that's due to our economic conditions and, of course, the pandemic. But then also we know that we've had some issues processing visas as well.
We've been doing a little work on this recently, and using a slightly different metric, you sort of extrapolate the 2019 trends for immigrant workers and for native-born workers. We have a total shortfall of those trends of about 5.2 million workers. So the same stylized picture emerges, like where are the workers? But it's not the immigrants' fault. They're about 700,000 below trend, essentially back to trend. So that's what Ben was wondering. Native-born, 4.5 million workers missing. And so the willingness of immigrants to work longer, retire later, all of those metrics has always been a key hallmark, and it's still true today, even in the pandemic.
When you talk about the native-born workforce that hasn't come back from COVID, do we know who they are, where they're coming from?
I was hoping Ben would tell me.
Ben, who are our missing workers in the native-born workforce?
It's a mixture, but Goldman Sachs did a study about a year ago that found that the majority of those who left the workforce during COVID were those who are over the age of 55. And a large majority of that group retired. And so I think a large chunk of that gap that we are seeing may not come back. And this is symptomatic of a much longer term trend that we've been experiencing in the labor market, that since the middle of the 2000s, labor force participation rate has been declining, largely because of the baby boomer generation reaching retirement age. And every time we hit a recession, that trend accelerates somewhat, and despite a bounce back in the late 2010s. So that's one issue. Beyond that longer term demographic issue, there's been issues with childcare and the caregiving being an issue for working families. There's been challenges. There's always challenges with workforce development, people wanting to get skills to switch to new industries or new jobs, and that creates a lot of friction for getting back to the workforce.
Going back to the difference between immigrants and native-born workers, a couple of things that you said there and something Doug said triggered to me. Doug said that immigrants are likely to retire later, and we're seeing an acceleration of retirement of native-born workers. Immigrants may not have access to the same skills training and things like that as native-born workers. So those workers that are taking time off to get more education or training, whatever, immigrants don't have that. So do you see those factors as also being relevant when we look at the difference in labor force participation between the two demographics?
Certainly at this point, that's turning out to be a big deal. I'm going to add two more things to Ben's list. There's this sort of long laundry list of what could be keeping the workers out of the labor force. One is opioids. Ben's done a lot of research over the years about the impact of opioids on labor force participation. That is the second national health emergency that we have in process at the moment. And we're guessing that there could be something like 1 million to 1.5 million of the missing workers who are victims of the opioid epidemic. Again, in the data, that appears to be a native-born phenomenon and not an immigrant's phenomenon. So there's a big difference in the impact on the numbers there. And then the real wild card that I have no idea about is long COVID. We don't know what long COVID is. Everyone has their own definition, but something like 30 million Americans say they have long-term symptoms from COVID-19, and about 10% of them say they can't work because of it. That gets you 3 million people. It's probably too big, but there may be something going on out there in the long COVID land as well.
If I can build on Doug's last point, there's also an issue of folks with immune and suppressed immune systems and other underlying conditions being potentially preventing them from reentering the labor force. There was a study done, I would say about 6 months ago, that found that 2 to 3 million people would fall under that category and have not returned to work or other aspects of life because of their underlying health conditions.
So, a lot of what we've talked about is sort of the impact of COVID on these trends. But, there were some of these trends predated COVID. How much of this can we say is sort of, we think, solvable in a relatively short term? And how much is this is a long-term issue we have to deal with?
So from my point of view, this is all about the long-term issue. And the short-term aspect is we need to get to this quickly and stop putting off doing a serious reform. It is literally true that by designing our visa granting system, we will dictate the labor force of the future, how fast it grows, the composition of skills, and we will have the capacity to use it to the great advantage of the United States if we choose to. So far, we haven't done that. That there's no question that's the most important long-term economic policy issue in my view. It's not the answer to our short-run problems, right? So you're not going to solve this missing gap, the 4.2 million or 4.5 million native-born workers who aren't come back to the labor force by getting 4.5 million immigrants overnight. That's not feasible. That's way too big. The skill matches wouldn't be what's out there in the economy. You'd create more problems than you'd solve. But the fact that it won't solve our short-term problems should not deter us from pursuing immigration reform and really set us up for the 21st century. We're not doing that. It's a missed opportunity.
So let's talk about the kind of immigration reforms that might be needed here. I mean, Ben did mention that, because of COVID, we've had fewer legal immigrants coming. So that sort of compounded just the numbers issue. Some of those are policies that we can probably help with. We've commented here on the podcast that we have huge backlogs across our immigration system in processing. We have backlogs at USCIS in adjudicating visa petitions and applications. We have backlogs at State Department overseas and issuing visas at consulates and getting people who are eligible into the United States. So some of this is just kind of digging out of the backlogs. But if we are going to look at what we need our immigration system to do over the long term, as you say, Doug, what do you think are the key reforms that we should be looking at?
Well, I think we ought to grant more of our visas on economic criteria. Right? We have relatively few, 5% or so, that of permanent visas that are really explicitly tied to some sort of economic criteria. The vast majority go back to other principles which have been proud pillars of U.S. immigration policy: family unification, refugee asylee status. Those are important, but I think we ought to increase the fraction that are coming from explicit consideration of someone's contribution to the economy. And so in my view of the universe, that really amounts to a resume reading approach where, an immigrant comes and they can speak English, they have some a higher education, maybe a PhD, they have some experience in the labor force. You can essentially give them points for all this and say, wow, what a great candidate, you're hired. Come to the US, you get a visa. Other countries have point systems. Canada has a point system, for example. There was a bit of a point system in our last real run at immigration reform. So this is not something that's, theory. We could do this. We need to apply more, effort on that front. My only concern with that is that's really good at documented skills, but we don't know somebody who had a pretty shaky high school career and whose resume isn't pristine, who's just absolutely a fantastic worker. And you want to get that into the labor force and you want to get that into immigration that dictates the labor force. And there, I think the best thing would be a more aggressive use of employer-based temporary visas. If you can get someone to hire you, you spend a couple of years on that. If you have a steady work record and you regularly participate in the labor market, that's how we decide success. People keep jobs, get raises. You have talent, and we want to have you. And so that's a second track that you could use to get people in and fill the different kinds of skills that we need. Let the market determine them. And I think that would be, I think that system would be a big improvement over where we are right now. And I guess the thing I want to emphasize is we aren't even trying. And we know that immigration has had this enormous contribution to the U.S. economy, like 40% of Fortune 500 CEOs, and all these things that you can roll out to support that. What if we tried? What if we had an immigration system that was about making the economy stronger? I think we'd have a huge impact.
So, Ben, I mean, what do you think about this? Are there particular skills that we know that we need in the economy that we could focus on if we're going to reform our immigration system?
Yes. Well, I would back up by saying we know in today's economy, we have really worker needs across all skill levels. And similar to what Doug was saying, it's important that we get those high skill immigrants in STEM fields, science, technology, math, and engineering, and to really help fill those positions in software companies, and we need doctors. We have a huge healthcare worker shortage, but also we need workers who are potentially lower skill who can help fill complementary service jobs and in jobs that a lot of native-born Americans typically may not necessarily take.
The other thing it seems to me that we're talking about is not just like the mix, but Doug, you started out by just saying we need more.
Yes.
So our legal immigration system right now admits somewhere around 1 million, 1.2 million new green card holders each year. We have probably another equal amount in temporary visas between the various temporary visa categories that we have in the United States. Do you think that's enough? I mean, Pew keeps asking this question. So does Gallup. Should we increase, decrease, or keep it the same? And it seems to divide up pretty evenly, a third, and a third. But as economists, what do you say?
So I would say more, unquestionably. And the arithmetic is that you have to decide what you think is an adequate level of top line growth in the economy. So suppose that you wanted that to not be 2%, you wanted it to be 3%. And suppose you thought it was reasonable that you could get 1.5 percentage points of productivity growth every year on average. That means the labor force has to grow at 1.5%, which means the population has to grow at 1.5%. And we know that the native-born are contributing negatively to that. And so we need enough immigration to grow at 1.5%. That's a number well north of 1 million. Okay, we have 310 million. We have to have a lot more than 1 million. That's the raw arithmetic of looking forward and saying, I think we need top line growth of 3%. If you do that, you run into the reality that the fraction of the population that's native born is sort of at a comparable level to the big immigration waves of the late 1890s. And those are periods where people became sort of anti-immigrant. And so at a time when we have a real public sentiment that strongly says not more, less, the arithmetic says do more. So you have to, that's the gulf that you have to bridge somehow to get a real economically based immigration reform.
So you're looking at sort of the macro, the economic growth numbers. Our colleagues who've been looking at our entitlements and our Social Security and our budget, we haven't really talked about budget issues. You ran the Congressional Budget Office. Like this is
no one
another.
wants to talk about that.
I know, but I mean, another way that people do look at this issue is whether immigrants are costing the country money from a budgetary standpoint. How do you construct that equation? What do you look at in those terms?
So at a point in time, it is true that when people come and work, they're paying taxes and supporting the big benefit programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They're not getting benefits. And so when a person comes into the U.S. and goes to work, they are a net fiscal surplus for the federal government. Now, over time, they will qualify for benefits, but and I want to come back to that, but the notion that somehow they just come in and suddenly they're a drain is a 100% wrong. The one place where there are real pressures are at the state and local level. If we have a lot more immigrants, we're going to have a lot more people who need public safety protections, and they're going to need schools, and they're going to need a lot of things that the states and localities provide. And they, I think, have the most concern about a large influx of immigration. That's a legitimate concern and something you have to think about in doing this. Now, people always talk about, they're going to qualify for Social Security, they're going to qualify for Medicare, and they're going to go broke. And that's true. But it's not the immigrants' fault. If we had a big baby boom, those programs would eventually go broke anyway. The programs are broken. It's not immigration, it's the programs. And so if you fix the programs, you can have both the immigration and the Social Security system of your dreams, and that's the way you should think about it.
Yeah. So for those who aren't paying attention, our current Social Security benefits systems are based on current workers paying for current retirees, right? Even though we all pay into this system during our working life, it's not like we're depositing in a bank account that we will just pull out our own money. We're pulling out our kids' money, basically, when we retire. Is that correct?
That is exactly right. And that system is going to fail us in under a decade for Medicare hospital insurance and in about a decade for Social Security. And so, you do need to fix those systems because they were built on the premise we'd have lots of young people for every old person, and that's just not true anymore. There's been a permanent shift toward an older population. We need more young people, true, but we also probably need to think about whether we have a realistic set of benefits for those now larger, older populations.
So Ben, looking at it from your perspective in the labor force, and you've been looking at the demographics. So the baby boomers are retiring and that their retiring is accelerating. I happen to be in the next generation behind them, Gen X, which is the smallest existing generation as I understand it. But we are getting close to that retirement age too. What about the generations coming back? How are millennials and Gen Z? I mean, my understanding was millennials is a pretty big generation. Are we still looking at how long are we going to have this issue with a big bubble at the later end of retirements?
Well, our birth rate in the United States is about 1.7, I believe, for every woman, and so that translates to not having enough workers to replace our own population. And so this issue of having a declining population will continue for the foreseeable future. What we really need to have is a birth rate of about 2.2 children per female. And that would get us to a place where we could try to equal things out over time. But without immigrants, we're not going to be able to get there because can't mandate that people have more children. And so immigration will be an important aspect for helping provide that younger population support to help, not only support these programs over the long term, but support our labor force and economy.
All right. So BPC recently published a report on legal immigration reform that was based on a couple of working groups that we highlighted some areas of agreement and consensus and areas that need further discussion if we're going to reform our employment-based legal immigration system. But let me ask you both, which areas do you think might be the most fruitful path forward in getting bipartisan legal immigration reform? And where do you think we're going to have the hardest time?
Go first, Ben.
Sure thing. Similar to what Doug said earlier, focusing on the economic needs of our country and designing a system around that will be, I think, the most fruitful path. Because particularly in today's environment, the case has never been clearer with all the shortages we're facing, and doing so will, I believe, get a lot more interest from folks on both sides. I think another element to this is focusing on the administrative aspect of our immigration system, making sure our immigration visa application processes are more transparent and predictable. These are things I think are fairly straightforward, and I think there's a lot of energy behind, particularly given the challenges that we faced during COVID with these processes. There's a lot of energy behind getting some resolution to resolve those. There's some energy behind resolving those issues.
So I want to really agree with Ben for mentioning the administrative issues. I mean, it's really a pressing national problem how poorly we run our immigration system, and so I would hope that we could get bipartisan support there. I think it's feasible to get bipartisan support on some targeted but important economic issues. Farm workers. I think there are farms in red and blue states, and they need workers, and we really have a crying issue of the bulk of the farm worker population being illegally present in the United States. And so this is a place where I think people could get together and solve something for that sector. Same's true for STEM and sort of grabbing high-skilled folks, particularly for cybersecurity and other things that are pressing national concerns. There are ways to do reforms that would essentially staple green cards to every PhD working in the U.S. And when they're newly granted, we just keep them, all of that stuff. Those strike me as doable. Broader immigration reform, the sort of core visa granting system, I think is a bridge too far at the moment. I hate saying that, but I think it's true. You have to do that along with border and dealing with the broad undocumented population simultaneously. And those efforts have always proven to be very, very difficult, fraught with pitfalls. There's been no talk of changing the basic visa granting system. People have talked about the border and they've talked about folks here illegally. But if you think about it, if you don't change the core visa system, you're right back to having those problems again, right? The whole thing's wrong. So got to fix all three. And I think that's a little bit too much for the political class to handle right now. So just keep trying to do the public education. Ben's right about that. At some point, it becomes an imperative and you get it done.
Yeah. I mean, we look at other countries. Japan, which has historically been very against immigration, is opening up in ways that I think many people would never have foreseen. Even Russia, these countries are they're facing aging and shrinking populations much more severe than we are. So it's probably something that, if we want to know what our future might look like, think about that.
So there's this fantastic story about Japan in the Olympics, and they didn't have enough workers to build the facilities. And so they actually had direct flights from Turkey to Tokyo for Kurds who were trying to escape persecution, and they were granting them the ability to enter the country to build the facilities. And so the Kurds built the Olympics. It's a fantastic immigration story. Japan never would have done that 10 years ago. Never. It's really amazing.
You did mention the status of the undocumented. I think we would be a little bit remiss if we didn't talk about that a little bit here. I mean, are they, if we were to legalize people already here, is that adding to the workforce, or are they people that are already in the workforce? What is your sense on that?
They're already in the workforce, and we would essentially be providing a path to legal status. We would be giving them the ability to have broader access to much of what this country has to offer. There are many already paying into our federal systems by paying taxes. More would do so, and it would, help provide an easier path for more of the undocumented to enter the workforce at an even higher rate and build, stronger, more productive careers in our economy.
But it's not going to address the longer term issues.
It won't affect the long-term size of the working age population, things like that. It would be good for the economy almost immediately in the sense that we would now have them free to move around the labor market without any restriction. Right now, a lot of them are nervous about being, caught. And so we got people with PhDs driving taxis, and that doesn't make any sense. You want everyone in the job where they're most productive. So we'd get a benefit from that. And that's one thing to keep in mind when these issues come up.
All right. Well, thank you both very, very much for this wonderful conversation about immigration and the economy. And I hope that our listeners have learned a few things and maybe we'll ask a few more questions when these issues come up. But thank you very much, Doug Holtz-Eakin and Ben Gitis, for joining us on This Week in Immigration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Brown at BPC_T Brown, and I'm on Twitter at Hannah E. Tai. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.